Hello everyone. As promised, I am going to record a separate video file for our lessons. So the last coverage for the second quarterly exam will be on Protista. So sinabi natin that Protista or protists, no, these are eukaryotic organisms that are not animals, not plants or fungi, And unlike other groups of organisms, it's difficult to draw a unifying feature among protists. Okay? And the reason for that is because it's a mura siya, para siyang temporary na classification wherein if an organism is plant like, animal like, or fungi like, then it will be put in this classification. Okay? And alam natin that a eukaryotic it's eukaryotic organism. Okay? So ito yung first natin na how do you say, first na classification of organisms na kung saan eukaryotic, we have been talking about prokaryotic organisms, when we talked about domain eukarya, domain bacteria and archaea, and and for this one, it's considered a protist naman if a eukaryotic organism um, lacks some features, no, vital features that would place it with fungi, plants, or animals. Okay, and it's a little strange to look into this group in the first glance, but many of its members are known to play important roles in human health, welfare, and ecology, and even in nutrient cycling, just like other prokaryotes. So that we will be covering in our lesson for today. So more specifically, we should be able to map out evidences of evolution of multicellular organisms from unicellular ones, no, that's provided in the evidences of eukaryotic evolution, okay, and discuss representative protist species based on their general characteristics and assess the ecological and economic importance of protists. So we are starting with the episode on enfolding. So sinabi natin that the modern day eukaryotes that we have today were a product of once prokaryotic cells, As a matter of fact, it's protists uh, it is protists that were considered as the first eukaryotes, And alam natin yung difference ng eukaryotic from prokaryotic cell is the presence of a more complex cell structure and compartmentalization, di ba? They have these membrane-bound organelles and nucleus. Okay? And nagkaroon daw ng eukaryotic cells na nagkaroon ng membrane folds or like membrane compartmentalizations because many prokaryotes later on had enfoldings of their outer membranes. So before, this structure right here is rigid, Okay? Yung rigid na cell structure, nawala daw ito siya during the course of evolution, and nung nawala yung rigidity ng cell wall, this allowed the cell membrane to fold inward, thus increasing the surface area. So habang nagfo-fold siya, what happens is patuloy na nadadagdagan yung surface area that's in the cell membrane, on the outside. And what happened is later on, yung enfolding na to enclosed organelles and even the genetic material, So this is evident kasi among all eukaryotic organisms, at yung parang best evidence for this is because similar yung cell wall that's surrounding or enclosing the whole membrane, the whole cell, eukaryotic cell, with that of the membrane that's enclosing organelles and the nucleus, So ito daw yung sinasabi dito na thought to have evolved from such enfoldings yung eukaryotic cells that we see today. Okay? Another theory that is being tawag dyan, it's currently accepted on how eukaryotic cells came to be what they are today is on the theory of endosymbiosis. Okay? Endosymbiosis, it means living together, right? In close association. We have discussed this in a brief on our module on domain bacteria, okay? And basically, bacteria, it was once thought that mitochondrion was a separate entity, no? And this ancestral eukaryotic cell right here, as you can see, no, internalize an aerobic alpha bacterium, okay? And and scientists here propose that this ancestral eukaryotic cell right here, which already had its internal system of membrane. So natapos na daw yung episode of enfolding, no, before theory of endosymbiosis. It internalized or engulfed an aerobic alpha bacteria, which then became mitochondria within the eukaryotic cells, ano? And this one is beneficial, no? Naging symbiotic yung kanilang relationship because mitochondria can pump up ATP ions, right? It can make energy, which can fuel the rest of the cellular processes of eukaryotic organisms. In return, what the whole eukaryotic system does is it can provide the raw materials for the mitochondria to come up with energy. And it can also serve as a protection. Di ba kasi nasa loob siya, it will not be very much susceptible to external factors. Ano? And sinasabi din that chloroplast originated in this way, pero naging nauna daw yung tawag dyan, yung internalization ng aerobic bacterium becoming the modern day mitochondria compared to that of a photosynthetic bacterium naman kay chloroplast, no? And the reason for this is because all um, eukaryotic cells possess mitochondria but not all possess chloroplast. So kung nauna do si chloroplast, dapat lahat ng eukaryotic cells are capable of photosynthesis, but that is not the case with what we see today. Okay? And sinasabi din on the theory of endosymbiosis, ito naman yung about plastids. Ano? Plastids can be 3 or 4 membranes, no, in some, but many of the plant cells possess 4 membrane plastids, no? And this is a product of secondary endosymbiosis. Bali, two-part endosymbiosis daw yung for the case of plastids. In primary endosymbiosis, kung titingnan nyo dito, you have here a photosynthetic cell that is being engulfed and retained by a single-celled protist, and it produced yung plasmids with 2 bounding membranes. So, ito siya, okay, this one contains this chloroplast with 2 membranes, ano? It was engulfed by another single-celled protist, ano? And later on, nagkaroon siya kasi double membrane na siya, yung whole cell na to, nagkaroon na siya ng 4 membranes. Okay? And this is found mostly in higher plants and even in green algae, no? Red algae and even glaucophytes. Okay? Sa secondary endosymbiosis naman, this red or green algae was engulfed or retained by another eukaryotic host cell naman, and it resulted in a plastid with 4 bounded membranes, ano? And this one right here, the secondary endosymbiosis resulted in the diversity of photosynthetic life forms that are present today. Okay? So, it's just a summary, no, of what these have on the explanation on how eukaryotic organisms came to be. So sinabi natin kanina that protists are the first were the first eukaryotic cells, ano. And it's basically a bunch of misfits. Sinabi natin na para siyang temporary na drawer, or para siyang if you tidy your room, there will always be a compartment or a drawer in your room na wala siyang classification. Hindi siya undergarments, hindi siya school supplies, basically hindi niyo siya malagay in any other na drawer. So ito yung analogy with that of protists, no? They can be plant-like as in the case of algae, they can be animal-like as in the case of dinoflagellates, or they can be fungi-like in the case of slime molds. Okay? And if we try to look at the cladogram of the whole of eukaryotic diversity, um, it contains in some books, no, merong 4 or 5, no, but in our module we will have 4 supergroups. So ito yung susundin natin. Excavata is actually one. Okay? Ang sarclade naman is a combination of these chrome alveolata and rhizaria, 'di ba? The straminophiles, archaeplastids, I know, not archaeplastids. Alveolates, and then rhizaria, and then you have archaeplastida, and then you have opistoconta, and then uniconta. Okay? So, pag-uusapan natin 'yan in our second half of discussion. So ngayon, we are just going to focus on the general characteristics, no, and features of these interesting organisms. So protists possess various cell surfaces. So yung one thing that's really unique about protists is they have this external shell that's commonly composed of calcium or silica. Okay? So added protection siya, actually. It's an evolution. It's thought to be an evolutionary response to protection. Kasi take note, protists are freely drifting um, in the water, no? In the water column. Most of protists are actually found in the marine environment, and they cannot afford protection against predators. So one of their evolutionary response to protect themselves from possible predators would be to come up with thickened external shell, no? Like say for example, for radiolarians, their outer shell is made of silica, and then for foraminifera, their outer shell is made up of calcium carbonate. So it's very easy to see under the microscope because radiolarians would be shiny, no? Lustrous kasi nga silica yung kanyang outermost shell. Whereas for foraminifera naman, yung kanyang outer shell is parang matte yung finish, parang dull yung finish niya kasi it's made up of calcium, no? The same with that of corals. Okay? So that's for support and protection. Another interesting feature among these organisms is that yung most novel method nila is ingestion. They would ingest their food particle, and this is chiefly exemplified by this picture right here, no, an amoeba eating a paramecium, which is also a protist, no, by the process of phagocytosis. So it's a process in which living cells ingest or engulf other cells or particles using pseudopodia. And in this process, 'di ba, once nagkaroon na ng food ng enclosure, a food vacuole will form which will digest the cell compartment of this paramecium right here, so that it will break open and then release yung nutrients for the amoeba to digest and to absorb. Okay? Another thing would be osmotrophy. Ilagay ko lang yung food vacuole dito na keyword, ayan. Ito yung food vacuole once nagkaroon ng closure. Osmotrophy naman, it's something similar to that with what fungi do, no? It's a process of absorption of dissolved nutrients directly from environment. So, kadamihan ng gumagawa nito will be that of the water molds and the slime molds, ano? And meron din tayong autotrophic na mga protists, as in the case of plant-like organisms, no, yung ating algae, no, it's mainly through photosynthesis because they have the pigments to do so. So that's another. Okay. Another interesting feature would be motility. So sinabi natin kanina that their most novel form of feeding, would be ingestion via pseudopodia. And that goes the same also for motility, because pseudopodia can be used for both feeding and locomotion, And the most well-known ability to move, it would be that of amoebas and slime molds, is the amoeboid motion. And this is by using these false feet, known as pseudopodia, right here as shown on the screen, wherein they can just slide over the substrate, primarily in search for their next dinner by the use of their pseudopodia. So pseudopodia, meron siyang four types depending on its on how it looks like. Okay? Like for example, Lobopodia, yung pseudopodia na to is it's a blunt na cylindrical protrusions. Okay? So medyo dull-ended siya, medyo makapal. Whereas if we try to compare with that of Philopodia, it's only situated on one side, no? Para siyang actin bundles, and usually kung nasaan yung part na merong uh, tawag dyan, merong pseudopodia, it's the active site of feeding, no? Or usually done via capturing prey and then directing the captured prey towards the oral region. Okay? Reticulopodia naman, similar siya in a Philopodia in terms of the structure of its pseudopodia. However, ano yung pinagkaiba nila? It's it radiates from the entire cell, no, from the entire protist na cell. Okay? Axopodia also similar with reticulopodia, pero relative to reticulopodia, axopodia na type of pseudopodia are stiffer. It's longer, no, and thicker siya na protoplasmic na extensions. Okay? So meron dyan yung mga example kung saan organism siya, but you don't need to really memorize that one. Okay? Yung four characteristics lang. Okay? And apart from pseudopodia, some protists would rely on locomotory organs for motility. Like alam natin merong flagella, yung ating whip-like structure, cilia for hair-like structure, and some can be freely floating. Okay? And lastly, yung interesting na characteristic among protists is that they can have several forms of reproduction and life cycle. Okay, so sexual reproduction is another eukaryotic characteristic, which wherein the origin can be traced back to protists. Okay, like say for example yung sa human, di ba, yung ating sex cells, di ba, or yung ating gametes are mainly produced via meiosis, and then the rest of our body cells are simply via mitosis, no? So kapag sinabing meiotically dividing, that means that yung number of chromosomes is now half, no? Whereas if it's mitotic, yung product na cells are just basically a copy, no? Exactly a copy. So in gametic meiosis, say for example, that's in the case of ciliated and flagellated na protists, no? The zygote would divide mitotically, so similar, no? The same yung amount of chromosome, no, to produce a multicellular diploid individual. Okay, and the cells from this diploid individual will undergo meiosis to produce haploid cells or gamete. So similar siya sa atin, no? Okay? For zygotic meiosis naman, this is basically meiosis after karyogamy. Karyogamy is the fusion of two cell nuclei, no? In this way, no, the organism will end its diploid phase to produce several haploid cells. Okay? So in here, the cells will divide first mitotically to form a multicellular individual or haploid cells. So yung living thing dito for zygotic meiosis, yung mature na organism is only possesses tawag dyan, half the number, no, of the original number of chromosomes, and the nagiging full lang siya is kapag nagkakaroon lang ng zygote. Kaya tinawag siya na zygotic meiosis. Okay? For sporic naman, it's in other textbooks you can find this sporic, no? It's also called intermediary meiosis. In here naman, instead of the zygote dividing meiotically, ito naman, ang zygote will divide mitotically. So after mitotic division of undersporic meiosis, you have two equal zygotes, no? And this will produce multicellular na diploid sporophyte. So meron siyang intermediate layer na sporophyte. It will not readily become gametes, no? Yung spores na to, yung sporophytes would create spores via meiosis, which will then divide mitotically. So from these spores, magkakaroon na naman siya ng from sporophyte, magkakaroon siya ng spores via meiosis, and then after the spores are formed, it will divide mitotically. So bale ano siya? Bale full, and then after ma-form ng full division, that's when I say full division, the same number of chromosomes, no? So after full division, magkakaroon ng multicellular na sporophyte. Yung sporophyte will create spores via meiosis. So kapag naging spores na siya, haploid na lang siya, half na lang ng chromosomes, no? And these spores right here will divide mitotically. So mararami siya via mitotic division, which will produce haploid individuals na nagkakaroon ng gametophyte. So as you can see, meron siyang sporophyte and spore na intermediate layer. Hence the name sporic meiosis or intermediary meiosis. Ano? And these spores later on can can develop into a mature individual when conditions become favorable. So this is in the case of algae, no? And this allows for the preservation of the species when conditions are unfavorable. So sinabi ko din last time sa synchronous meeting, no? Like for example, if you try to clean your pond na infested with harmful na algae, no? Over time, talagang babalik at babalik yan because these organisms are capable of producing spores. Spores na kahit i-bleach mo pa yung walls ng iyong pond, it will still remain there because that's this cyst is very much resistant to physical and chemical factors. Okay? So that's it for protist, ano? For the last meeting, no, we will be talking about the 4 supergroups. So we have excavata, the striminopiles, we have the alveolates, and then the Rhizaria clade, and then Archaeplastida, and then Uniconta. Okay? So thank you very much for listening. I hope this helps in your exam preparations. Okay? Bye-bye.